My name is Janet Selcer, and I was born in Cleveland, Ohio, in the mighty Midwest,
Uh-huh. And when was that?
1948. This year I will be 75.
So tell us a little about your childhood, ethnic background, neighborhood, siblings, that kind of thing.
I grew up in South Euclid, Ohio, which is a near suburb of downtown Cleveland. And I have one brother who's a bit older than me. And I grew up in a Jewish family, and that was an influence in my life. I don't think anybody in my family was terribly religious, but like a lot of Eastern European Jews, they had a very strong cultural tie to Judaism. And as dyed-in-the-world liberals, my parents did impart to me the notion that in Judaism, what you do to change the world is the most important thing. I grew up thinking there was no heaven and hell, and what you do now in the course of your life is what makes you a good person, and it's sort of a requirement of living a good life. My parents were both union members. My mother was a teacher for her entire career, and she worked while we were growing up, and they were unionized. I am guessing at that time it was the American Federation of Teachers. My father had a job that most people might not equate with unionism, which is that he was a violist in the Cleveland Symphony Orchestra, known as the Cleveland Orchestra, to be exact. Wow. And he did that for his entire career. But when he started, and throughout most of the time that he was in it, up until, say, the 60s and 70s, that was not a job like it is now. Now orchestra members are well paid, and they've, through unionization, bargained for good working conditions. But at the time in Cleveland, although the Cleveland Orchestra was a premier organization, one of the supposedly top 5 orchestras in the country, they didn't have a pension plan. They didn't have a full year of work because they had not yet built a summer home for the orchestra. The pay was low, and my father, in fact, always had a second job. He sold clothing in the May Company department store, men's clothing. So I learned of that. That was important. You know, not only was I kind of filled with classical music, but during the time I was still at home, the orchestra went on strike 2 times. And my father was one of the union activists in the orchestra. So I remember doing things like making picket signs with my mother at the kitchen table, and also listening to my father and our family friends who were in the orchestra have these vehement arguments and discussions about what they should be doing. So that too was an influence on me. Then there were other kinds of influences. I always remember that my father insisted I take typing in high school. And he told me, you know, that way I could always get a job. Little did I know that that was pretty much the only job I could get as a young person when I finally did move to Boston and became working age. So that's a little bit about where I'm from.
Great. What led you to the so-called second wave of feminism?
Well, I actually think I missed a lot of the direct influences that a lot of students in my generation were influenced by. I did start college. I went to college for 3 years in Wisconsin, but in 68 and 69, when things were really bursting in the student movement and in the beginnings of the women's movement, I was not that political. And I went overseas to live for almost a year, partly as a program from college and partly just because I wanted to stay. I didn't want to come back. And then when I came back, I had a lot of family issues and illnesses to deal with, and I dropped out of college. So I wasn't really part of the student movement. I kind of missed the first phases of the women's movement, I'd say. And that lasted for another period of time. But although I think, you know, despite my parents' liberalism and messages to me about taking action in the world, something about their liberalism didn't explain the world to me. And so when I was about, I'd say 22, 23, I started really learning about socialism and other ways of thinking about what was wrong with society. And it was really the first time I began to think about the difference between individual problems and problems that are systemic within society. And that did include women's issues as well. So at that time in my life, I knew some people that were quite involved in the women's movement, at least with women's groups, which, you know, were everywhere at the time. But I didn't really have a lot of that kind of experience until I decided that what I wanted to do was to organize. And I moved to Boston in 1969. As I said, I had a job as a clerical worker. In fact, though I worked at many places over a number of years, I worked several times for Harvard University, where much later the slogan, "We can't eat prestige," became the new truth, which I experienced firsthand. And I had a job there where I started a petition about some work conditions that everybody didn't like. And I was called into the personnel person's office at 5 minutes of 5 on Friday, which is the typical time to get fired. And they said, "You don't seem to be happy here." And that was a code expression.
Right.
You're fired.
Wow.
And that just contributed to my growing sense that where I belonged was doing something about the experiences I had as a clerical worker. And, you know, Boston at the time and still really ran on a paper economy. It wasn't a big manufacturing city like others I'd grown up with, like Cleveland. And really the banks, the insurance companies, the investment firms, the law offices, universities, publishing firms, they were all running because of office workers, and yet the pay and the treatment were, you know, pretty poor. And yet there was something about getting dressed up, going downtown, if it was a downtown office, and, you know, looking nice that I think drew a lot of particularly young women, particularly probably working class women who were now experiencing a job that might be very different from their parents, whether they were factory workers or whatever. And it seems somehow like it should be prestigious and good, you know. You got to wear pantyhose every day, you know, it just was a different kind of experience. And yet, I think under the influence of the women's movement, which had, you know, started to change culture, and started to change certain assumptions about what was okay and what was not in people's view of women, although, you know, certainly that hasn't ended. Women felt ignored, put down, belittled. I had a boss that didn't recognize me on the street when I said hello to him. It was that little in his mind who worked for him. Women were often training men to be their own supervisor, clearly able to do that job themselves, but not given it. And so I think the whole issue of respect on the job, let alone working conditions that people faced, were, you know, very much influenced by the women's movement. And although most of the clerical workers I worked with through 9 to 5 would say to you when you sat down with them, I'm not a women's liver. You know, they want to make that clear. But, and then there would be a long list of things that they would summarize by saying, I know it's all because I'm a woman.
Right.
That was good enough for us, you know, as a premise of organizing, you start where people are at. And it was clear that these young women and older women too knew the score, but they had to express it in their own way, in the way they felt comfortable. So I guess I can say that my real involvement in the women's movement started when I came to the 9 to 5 office after I got fired from Harvard and knocked on the door, and there were 2 people there in this tiny little office in the YWCA. It was right across the street from the John Hancock building, which had just renovated with these all glass windows, but the windows kept popping out. There was some design flaw and they would fall right in the street by our office. And we eventually took that as a symbolic notion about our strength and weaknesses of that industry.
That's great.
So there were only 2 people there. They were just about to launch the organization. It hadn't been started yet, although there had been a group that had done some planning about how they might start. And one of the women that I worked with for the next 10 years went to a training school for organizers called the Midwest Academy in Chicago.
Yeah.
Came back with what we hoped would be all the answers.
Right.
And I basically said, this is what I want to do. Can I do this? And at the time, you know, only one person was getting paid. The other one was still working part-time, also at Harvard. And I was getting unemployment payments because at the time, even if you got fired from a job, you were eligible for unemployment. I don't believe that's true anymore. So it was really by the seat of our pants. But they said, sure. And I remained at 9 to 5, started in Boston, became a national organization, organized a union parallel for the next 10 years.
Right, right. Now, who were the other women?
The other 2 women were Karen Nussbaum and Ellen Cassidy.
Right.
And we worked our brains out, you know, it was all we wanted to do. And like a lot of organizing jobs, it was so demanding. We just spent our life in that very cramped little office, and became each other's right hands and work buddies
Right.
And I still know them both.
Yeah. I know them both too. Just coincidentally.
There you go.
Yeah. Um, well, yeah, DC isn't that big, in a way. Anyway, so where did you organize? How did you start?
Well, you know, we we started with a newsletter, the 9 to 5 news, and we would get up really early and go to just stand out in front of the subway stops all over Boston, and would hand out this newsletter, um, in the freezing cold with,
Right.
wind making them fly away, and some people turning them down, men giving us very funny looks. But after a while, women would give these little smiles and, say, "Oh, I've read that," and take them. And it just tried to reflect back to women what we had experienced and what they were probably going through, no matter what office they worked in. Because I think what we often ran into was the fact that people appeared to be apathetic. Women appeared to, have the feeling you can't fight City Hall. But it seemed to us that behind that was a kind of fear and inexperience with collective action, that it wasn't that they didn't care, but they needed their jobs, they wanted their jobs, and they weren't sure what to do with it. Felt they couldn't complain for fear of retaliation. And so I think that we needed to legitimize the fact that we could make change and raise expectations that we deserve change. And so one of the first things we did was create a working women's Bill of Rights. We called that. It listed, I can't remember, 10, 13 points that covered everything from wanting job postings so that people would know where the openings were and could apply for them, and to sexual harassment. And that was something that was not talked about at the time.
Wow. Yeah.
Right? But was rampant in the office world, and demanding respect on the job, higher pay, pensions, contributions for childcare. It ran the gamut. But
Wow. How outrageous.
I know. But what we found was that these were the things women talked to us. When we passed out newsletters, there was always a little tear slip that said, want to know more about 9 to 5. And you could send that in. Or we did a lot of surveying. At the beginning of 9 to 5, we created surveys asking about women's experience and problems. Again, there was a thing you could cut off and send in saying, would you like to know the results of this survey? And we got those slips of paper back. If we did, and if the person listed their phone number, we would call them and ask them to meet us at lunchtime on their lunch hour, just to hear a little bit more, hear the results of the survey, whatever, something low key. And we ended up having 2 to 3 lunches a day, because we would go from place to place. And that's really where we got the content for the Bill of Rights.
Wow.
And, we started keeping records, and decided that we didn't really have a plan of action, but we decided we would have a meeting that made public the Bill of Rights and invite as many of the people that we met as we could. No idea whether or not it would come off, but we publicized it in the media. We had some women and others who were allies but known in Boston come and speak there. And, we set up a bunch of chairs in a room at the YWCA. And I think well over 100 people showed up. And
Amazing.
and some of the people that we met, some of the women who we talked with time and time again were willing to speak at this event. And they gave, one of the things that we did constantly is work really closely with women that started to get involved so that incrementally they could take on more and more responsibilities and really try to cultivate them as leaders. They gave, totally wonderful speeches. And it sort of took off from there.
Wow.
We divided into committees for different industries. I was the staff person for insurance and banking, which I thought was great because it was sort of the belly of the beast. They're organized in universities, which was probably a better place to organize because just due to some of the veneer of openness at universities, they were more in a corner as far as retaliation and other things, and people were able to get a little more active. Ellen worked particularly in the publishing industry. And, we went on from there.
Wow. And did you have some connection with Jane Fonda and that group on the movie 9 to 5?
Yeah, that came much later.
Did it?
I think, well, I'll come back to that. First of all, I think the most important thing we could do was teach people the collective action could work.
Okay.
And so we would organize campaigns and target a company and try to win any small victory and then really publicize it like crazy because we knew we weren't going to change everything all at once, but we absolutely needed to have women experience what it was like to be able to do something. And really it was the power of the media, a lot of humor, making fun of what was going on in the office, a lot of outrage that people could express, but also getting to know people on the inside of those companies who would pass us information about things that were going on. And they would feel like I can't be out in front of the company doing anything, but I can surreptitiously tell 9 to 5 what's happening. But we had other members not related to that company that felt free to go to the company and picket in front of it, pass out flyers, do more surveys, reveal the results, and it totally freaked out management. They acted from the beginning like we were one step away from being a union, which we were not.
You were not?
No.
Tell me why not?
Well, this was our theory at the time. We felt like this is just the beginning. Unions had shown pretty much zero interest in organizing office workers. We learned that later when we did form a union and interviewed a lot of union people to make a decision about which union we want to affiliate with for this branch of what we were doing. And, people that we sat down with said, well, we would organize office workers if I had a girl to do the typing. Then I would have more time to organize office workers. And other less mentionable phrases, like, I guess I can mention them in this context.
Please.
Women think with their cunt, not their mind, was another thing that somebody said to us face to face. But in any case, they had not started organizing in the office workforce and had a lot of stereotypes about why that wouldn't work. And as I said, women were just being introduced to the idea of taking any kind of collective action at all. And it was our belief that having a direct action organization, one that would use other kinds of approaches and pressures, whether it was legal enforcement of equal rights laws that were already on the books, that used information that would embarrass companies. And having that kind of experience of taking collective action was a preliminary step before that would happen.
Became officially a union. Can you give me like one example, one anecdote about a win you had?
Well, we had campaigns. We were pretty cheeky about it. We really felt that we could take on and should take on the big guys. We had year-long campaigns against First National Bank of Boston. We had a campaign against John Hancock, and modest demands like post jobs. And after a number of actions and going to state and federal regulators and looking into the company's affirmative action plan and trying to get them to put pressure on the company. And we didn't really pursue legal processes because that would get us involved with more individual women. It was often geared towards helping people get out of the clerical workforce. That wasn't our goal. We wanted to make the clerical workforce a good place to work for women that were in it. But that kind of pressure really helped. And after doing those kinds of things, in the case of John Hancock, they posted jobs. One day they just started posting jobs, and all our contacts inside started calling us and telling us about this. And then we absolutely claimed that victory, saying, you know, thanks to, you know, everybody for what they've done. You know, John Hancock has just started posting jobs, and we would leaflet that in front of the company. We would tell the media about it. And then we went on to raises. And in the case of John Hancock, they gave, I can't remember, but it was a substantial raise, like a 10% increase across the board for women.
Wow.
And it was really because they were scared. They didn't want this to go anywhere. And so the idea was to buy off people. They even became the first company we knew of to start a fund for offsetting some of the costs of childcare, which I don't think that developed industry-wide, but at that time, it was something that they did. So that was, you know, one example.
And that's pretty amazing. So I was just curious, were jobs posted in men and women separately at the time?
Oh, yes.
They were.
Thanks for reminding me. I can't believe this now, but in the Boston Globe, for example, or the Herald, there was a help wanted men and a help wanted women section. You know, unbelievable, or believable, all too believable, but that was for getting a job. For inside the company, they didn't really do that. It would have been illegal. And they certainly had that much sense. They couldn't say this job, you know, no women need apply. But as I said, there were office workers that were very experienced, often were doing that job without recognition of pay. And then hire a young man, often younger than the women in charge. That person would have to train the young man into that job position. And, you know, it's just so insulting. You know, the victories we won, we were very aware that they weren't like a contract. They weren't enforceable. And so I think we knew and believed that to lock those kinds of things in for long-term change, you would need to have bargaining rights. But for the sake of creating change and creating a different kind of culture for the sake of, scaring bosses silly, which did happen. They, even organized themselves into the Boston Survey Group and an organization called The Vault, where we were able to prove that they were doing wage fixing. It was kind of like price fixing, but they compared notes,
Ah,
you're not supposed to share information about your pay. That was one of the things that was really hard to break through until
right.
women who were members of 9 to 5 started saying, I am going to talk about that. And of course, that was because all sorts of bad information came out about how there were not salary structures and pay scales that were fair.
Right.
And then we learned again through information memos that we got, internal memos that people would slip to us from inside their company, that there were these organizations and they were looking at pay scales, industry by industry. And at the time, great Attorney General Frank Bellotti took it up and basically said that it was illegal to do this. And that was another
Wow.
change. Can't say for certain that they didn't keep doing it or disbanded those organizations, but they publicly were told not to do it anymore.
Right. And what year was that?
Oh, let's see. Well, I think that must have been somewhere probably 1977, 78,
Okay.
because I worked locally in Boston for the first 5 years I was with 9 to 5. But after about 5 years, we started getting letters and phone calls from all over the country from groups of women that wanted to become 9 to 5, or they wanted to start a 9 to 5 in their city. And at the time, there was only maybe 2 organizations, us in Boston and an organization called Women Employed in Chicago. They had a slightly different focus than us. It would, maybe I can say a little bit more oriented towards women being able to access management jobs. But we decided that we could expand. And at that point, Karen Nussbaum and I became part of the national staff, which initially was us. But
okay.
began answering women, and because we had good grant funding, we were able to travel to where they were, and with our Midwest Academy training, help them learn about starting an organization, how you could do that. And that became my job for the second 5 years of my time at 9 to 5 as the director of organizing and training. And so I would go to
Travel a lot.
I would travel a lot to these other locations and work with both the staff members and the women that were becoming leaders. And I would also have weekly phone appointments with all the directors of the organizations. It started out slowly, but we ended up with about 18 chapters around the country in many large cities. And it was more around that time that Jane Fonda came into the picture.
Oh, okay.
That was a long
I
way
didn't want
around.
to jump ahead.
Right.
So, okay, Jane Fonda came into the picture, or I mean, what did she call you guys or what?
Well, actually, Karen Nussbaum had a tie with Jane Fonda because Karen had been very active in the anti-war movement. And as you remember, so was Jane Fonda. And so Jane was aware of what Karen was doing now. And at one point asked, what can I do to help? And Karen said, well, why don't you make a movie?
Really?
Yeah. And that was something that she was interested in doing. She didn't, I don't think, start out knowing it would be a comedy, but I think when she found out all the stories about the treatment of office workers, she thought people aren't going to believe this unless it's funny. And it was a great thing because she did her homework. She talked to our members for good chunks of time. She went to Cleveland, she came to Boston. We, by that time, were holding yearly working women's summer schools. The early ones were at Kent State, then they went to Bryn Mawr College, and our staff and members from all around the country would come for 3 days. For a lot of women, this was the first kind of conference they had been to, but it was filled with workshops, speeches, skits. We had the habit of using a lot of music. We always changed the words to songs and did a lot of singing with people, and often highlighting a national campaign, and our campaigns became more national. And at one of them, Jane Fonda came, spoke to members again, and gave a speech at that summer school. And then when they actually had the setup for starting a film, we were asked to consult on the set. One of our staff people went there, and because I was working with our Los Angeles Working Women's Organization, I went there too. And what we were able to do with Jane Fonda is that she agreed to do what we called brown bag lunches for women office workers. And in each city that she went to, and she went to a number of them, she would attend a rally that we organized for women. And
Wow.
of course, you know, we always got very good publicity, but when Jane Fonda was the guest at a working women's lunch, literally 1,000 people would come. And, you know, it just publicized what we were doing even
Right.
beyond our wildest dreams. And then she also allowed us to have premieres of the movie in different cities to raise money. So it was a big contribution.
I'll say. Well,
But
I
the
am very,
stories involved were ones that came out of the mouths of members of 9 to 5.
I am really curious about your songs.
Oh,
And
yeah.
do you have any like a stanza or something that you remember?
Yeah, I can, well, the oldest song, and, you know, maybe my favorite, was to the tune of, you may not know this, but Charlie on the MTA.
Oh, sure, I know it.
Yeah. What was it? Who was that? The Kingston Trio, I think.
Right.
This is like old history.
Yeah,
But
my
there was a
age
very
group.
popular song
Right.
about the Boston subway system, and in it, Charlie gets on, and somehow he just can't get off because he doesn't have the fear to get off, and on and on. But we changed the words to that, and was, let me see, it says, let me tell you the story of a woman named Susie who applied for a job one day. They tested her for typing, for shorthand and speed writing, then they gave her the lowest pay. And then the chorus was, we type and file 9 to 5, yet we barely stay alive, working from day to day. Well, we've done a day's work in the offices of Boston, and it's time we got a day's pay.
Oh, boy.
It goes on for a lot of verses. We also changed the words to the sort of labor, it's kind of a labor song, The Banks of Marble, which I think Pete Singer sang. I don't know whether he was the first one. And that was like, the banks are made of marble, women work on every floor, and it's time we got together. That's what 9 to 5 is for. And went on and on.
Nice.
And, it's just the kind of solidarity and spirit that
Absolutely.
strong
Absolutely.
believer in music for movements.
Yeah. No, it's fun but it's very, very real in what you're singing about. We need a day's pay. That's really great. Well, then you left 9 to 5 is what
I
happened?
did. Can I tell you one more thing before that?
Oh,
Which
please,
I
please.
just wanted to make clear that when we did approach unions about creating a union, we
Oh,
kept those two organizations separate. 9 to 5 continued as a non-union direct action organization. And the union, which we called in Boston Local 925, organized separately, although obviously they got a lot of contacts from us, and we
right.
could also, and the staff sort of crossed over to some 9 to 5 staff became the union staff. So people were very familiar with what places looked like they might organize, but they were kept separate. And then eventually, the union that we chose was Service Employees International Union, SEIU. They were very open to organizing unorganized workers, along with, one or two other unions, but they were the one that was willing to give us the most latitude in how we organized. And we really saw ourselves bringing together the women's movement and the labor movement. We've perceived that the women's movement had a lot to say and a lot of influence, but was mostly, or at least partially in good part, attended to by more middle class and more white women. And we wanted to change that. The labor movement, meanwhile, wasn't organizing women workers and didn't understand that the issues were somewhat different, but they were real and important. So that's why, I think we certainly had a feminist slant, whatever we called it, and we had a labor slant. And the idea was to bring those things together and create a powerful women's organization where women were the leaders and the staff people. And SEIU really bought into that. So,
And does the group still exist?
well, it does, but both 9 to 5 exists, and it does it's sort of broadened. It does different work than what I was familiar with. So it's not just organizing office workers, it's taking up issues of low income and poor women more generally. It has a couple of offices in the country. What happened to 925, the union, was the result of a number of factors that were basically beyond our control. You can build a movement, but you have to have the right conditions to have it really take off. And if those conditions change, you may suffer the consequences. And what happened was that, first of all, office work became much more automated, and the typing pool and the individual secretary for a boss began to change as computers were introduced.
Right.
Also, there was a lot of globalization, and as has happened in other manufacturing industries, some of the work that office workers did went overseas, like call centers and data entry systems. And probably most prominently, there was a really ferocious anti-union, union busting effort on the part of employers. And to my knowledge, it was at that time that union busting firms became big business. And that really, and it remains true to this day. It was during the Reagan administration. You know that a lot of things, a lot of anti-union things happened there.
Mhm.
And that was true, like in the airlines industry with the pilots strike that he completely put down. That happened to organizing efforts. So eventually, quite a number of years later, and after I had left 9 to 5, the national district had to disband, and its members, there were, thousands of members, but not enough to sustain it, were siphoned off into other SEIU locals. There is a large local 925 that still remains in Seattle because there was a successful union drive at the University of Washington. And also they did childcare organizing among childcare workers. And those union units still remain, and they're very strong. And so local 925 does exist there.
I see. Wow. So it's whatever's left is part of SEIU. So,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. And, other unions eventually did get into office organizing. So there are some
Right.
locals and, public sector office workers were and increasingly got organized.
Right.
Private sector office workers, which is what we focused on,
Right.
didn't in the large numbers that we hoped.
Yeah. Very interesting. Well, you say the times changed, or
Yeah.
technology changed. Wow, that was amazing. So what'd you go on to do after that?
Well, I left 9 to 5 about 2 weeks before my first child was born.
Oh, okay.
I was also ready at that point to move on for a variety of reasons. And I ended up staying home with her for a year. And then my son was born, and there was this 6-year period of time where I worked part-time. But the other really significant experience I had came a bit later when they were school age, and that is I went back to school and got my bachelor's degree, which I had not felt I needed. I felt like everything I want to learn, I'm learning
Right.
from what I'm doing. But I became very interested in the process in school reform and parent involvement in schools and the achievement gap. And just to make it short, eventually I started an organization here, actually in Brookline, where nobody thinks there's low-income students, but in fact, there's quite a lot of public housing, called Steps to Success. And it still exists 20 years after it was started. I, began it and worked on it for, I'd say 15 years of the 20 years I was, part of the school system. And it was a comprehensive program that wanted to change the direction that most of the kids that were in public housing were going, because many of their parents were immigrants, working more than one job just to put food on the table. Almost all of them didn't have a college education themselves, and certainly not the money to pay for one or the information to know what to do to prepare their kids for it. So 9 to 5 sought to change that by providing programming for those kids that would get them onto college campuses as young as 5th grade, and give them exposure to opportunities through after-school programming, summer internships that were paid as jobs, and very close counseling from our staff who worked. We had offices in the school, and they worked with students starting in 4th grade and going through high school graduation. And then eventually we started a college success initiative, and staff people followed them right through college. And the post-secondary education, whether it was college or something else, went from about 30% of these students even applying to college to now, for many years and currently, you know, 90-some% of
Wow.
students go to college, and in the high 70s, complete it within 4 to 6 years, which is way higher than the average for that income grouping
Yeah.
of kids. So I won't go on about that, but that was, you know, and I really took my organizing experience from, it's a lens that I generally see things through.
Wow.
And so in Step Success, we organized a high school leadership team of our students and trained them like we trained office workers to, you know, be able to speak in public, to figure out how to reach out to their fellow students and get them involved, all the things that we would do with our members. And we also started a parent council, and, you know, basically listened to what parents were concerned about. A lot of times it was special education classifications that knocked their kids out of scheduling for things that would have put them on a different kind of track. And you know, with them, it was the same thing. They hadn't done anything like this before, but we had meetings with the superintendent and also took them to college campuses so they could learn about what was going to be involved and how to fill out financial aid forms and all that kind of stuff.
Wow.
So that was work that I loved. And, you know, between 9 to 5 and that, I feel like I was very fortunate to have the working career that I had.
And you did what your Jewish cultural background dictated.
Hope
Change
so.
the world. I think so. It
Yeah.
sure sounds like it to me. That's great.
You know, and I'm still doing it, though now as a volunteer in retirement with a different set of
Right, right.
goals.
And so what are you doing as a volunteer?
Well, I have become very involved with an organization called Movement Voter Project, VP for short. And it's a national organization that raises funds for grassroots local organizations, primarily in communities of color and among youth. And what it brings to them is funding so that they can continue to figure out what the issues are in their own communities, with MVP supporting them, because the overarching goal of the organization is to create a progressive movement in the country. But it also, if they didn't already have that, brings them all the training and capacity building they need to participate in elections and get their members to understand the different issues that they campaign about all year long are also tremendously affected by who's in office, going from school committees and sheriffs and attorneys general all the way through the presidential election. And they target particularly really close elections, which we're now all more familiar with than we were before, given the current situation in swing states, where a turnout of unlikely voters, you know, marginalized voters, can completely make the difference. And we've seen that happen time and again. The polls are often of already registered voters. They completely miss all the people that haven't been registered because primarily they've given up on elections having anything to do with them in their lives. But when they're organized about issues that they identify in their own neighborhoods and have the same experience we're talking about with 9 to 5, have an experience of collective action and seeing that there can be at least some shift in power,
Wow.
then they're much more likely to vote. And I count on that for keeping us out of deep trouble that will come in the next election.
Yeah.
And our role as volunteers is not organizing. We're not in those communities. And we have more privilege than many of the people in those communities do. So we are essentially creating a movement of donors, people that we reach out to raise
that's
money.
important too. Definitely.
Which is something we can do.
Do you reach more women, do you think? Are women more likely to get involved in that sort of thing?
Well, actually, when I think of our volunteer hubs that are doing this work, it's pretty equal. I think women are drawn to it for sure, and there's a lot of leadership from women in the organization, both on our volunteer side and the organization's staff. But I think just because of the threats we're under right now to the rights of so many people and to democratic institutions, it has spanned interest to everyone. People are more concerned than they would be previously, I think.
Yeah. And I wondered if you had any closing remarks.
Well, sometimes you work really hard and you win some and then you see things fail. We were always, we were very interested as we did this work in labor history and women's history, and we knew, and the civil rights movement, we knew we were standing on the shoulders of all those organizations and people that came before us. And we could see that there was a cycling of events and that, they came in waves. They could be very strong. They had huge influence in inching forward on equal rights. And then there's a backlash. And so I think the thing I'd say is that in organizing, you absolutely have to take the long view and realize that as long as there is inequities, there's going to be a fight. And drawing people into that fight is what's important. And, I just keep hope that, eventually we will win.
Right.